There is no official record of the exorcism we performed at Riverton Asylum in upstate New York last December. The church discourages us from speaking to the press about such matters, as our work tends to be sensationalized. In reality, most cases we investigate are not possessions at all, but tragic mental health issues cloaked in religious imagery. I was just over a year into my apprenticeship when the call came. Until then, even the few genuine possessions I had witnessed were far more mundane than the horror films would have you believe. My mentor, Father Augustine, would meticulously follow the protocols outlined by the Holy See: sprinkling holy water, laying of hands, and exsufflation, along with the recitation of prescribed prayers. We had never encountered a case where the basic prayers failed entirely. The most challenging exorcism involved a middle-aged woman who had been possessed for nearly a decade. The family, believing it was schizophrenia, only sought help when she began speaking in ancient languages and levitating objects. Even then, Father Augustine managed to expel the demon within a month using the prayer to Saint Michael and a relic of Saint Benedict. Nothing could have prepared us for the horror awaiting us at Riverton Asylum. The request came from Dr. Emily Hughes, the head psychiatrist at the asylum. She had noticed that a patient named Mark Johnson, previously diagnosed with severe dissociative identity disorder, had become increasingly violent and unresponsive to treatment. Concerned, she visited Mark's room and was greeted by an eerie silence. What she encountered led her to contact us immediately. The voicemail she left was filled with urgency and fear. The smell was the first thing, a stench of decay and rot that permeated the entire asylum. As I approached Mark's room, the air grew heavier, almost suffocating. I hesitated at the door, then heard a low, guttural growl that didn't belong to any human. Entering the room, I saw Mark crouched in the corner, his back turned to me. He was gnawing on something, and the floor was littered with bones. Animal, I hoped. His skin was pallid, his frame skeletal, and his eyes were black, void of any light. "Mark?" I called out, and he turned slowly, his mouth smeared with blood. "Mark, what are you doing?" He smiled, a grotesque, unnatural grin. "Feeding," he replied in a voice that wasn't his own. "Would you like a taste?" As I backed away, the door slammed shut with a force that broke 2 of my fingers. I managed to escape, but I fear for that boy's soul. We need help, now. Father Augustine listened to the message with a furrowed brow. He then consulted his ancient tomes while I replayed the voicemail, trying to grasp the gravity of the situation. "How severe is it?" I asked when he returned. "It is what it is," he replied. "We follow protocol. Evaluate the situation. If it requires a major exorcism, we'll use the prayer to Saint Michael until it's done. Pack your large suitcase. We might be there a while." "Father, has the prayer ever failed?" "No," he said firmly. "Demons are cowards. With faith and perseverance, they always flee." Father Augustine's faith was unwavering, his belief in the power of the rituals absolute. To him, the universe was orderly, bound by laws divine and immutable. I admired his certainty, even as doubt gnawed at me. We drove through the desolate upstate countryside, arriving at the asylum as dusk fell. The building loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the twilight sky, its windows barred and walls covered in creeping ivy. Dr. Hughes met us at the gate, her eyes hollow and red from weeping. She barely managed a greeting before leading us inside, the air thick with the stench she had described. Father Augustine handed me a handkerchief soaked in holy water to mask the smell. The asylum was a relic from the early 1900s, its hallways lined with peeling wallpaper and flickering lights. The atmosphere was oppressive, each step echoing through the silent corridors. We reached Mark's room, and Dr. Hughes hesitated before opening the door. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's not himself." Father Augustine gave a reassuring nod, then pushed the door open. The sight that met us was worse than anything I could have imagined. The room was a charnel house. Bones, both animal and human, were strewn about, and the walls were covered in cryptic symbols scrawled in blood. In the center of the room, Mark stood, his eyes black as coal, a sinister smile playing on his lips. "Welcome, priests," he hissed. "I've been expecting you." Father Augustine began the rites immediately, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers, but Mark, or the thing possessing him, only laughed. The temperature in the room plummeted further, and an invisible force knocked the crucifix from Father Augustine's hand. "Your God has no power here," Mark snarled, his voice a cacophony of otherworldly tones. "This is my domain." I felt a wave of fear wash over me, but I forced myself to move forward, picking up the crucifix and joining Father Augustine in prayer. The demon laughed again, but there was a flicker of hesitation in its eyes. We continued the exorcism for hours, the demon's resistance growing weaker with each prayer. Suddenly, Mark's body convulsed, and a deafening roar filled the room. The windows shattered, and the room was engulfed in a blinding light. When the light faded, Mark lay unconscious on the floor, his eyes closed and his skin regaining a semblance of its former color. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and a sense of peace settled over the room. Father Augustine and I carried Mark to the infirmary, where Dr. Hughes wept with relief. The asylum staff, who had been keeping a fearful distance, cautiously approached to help. "We did it," I whispered, more to convince myself than anyone else. "Yes," Father Augustine replied, his voice steady. "But remember, the battle against evil is never truly over. We must always be vigilant." As we left the asylum, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within me. The experience had tested my faith and my resolve, but it had also strengthened my belief in the power of good over evil. Father Augustine and I drove back in silence, the weight of what we had faced settling heavily on us. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but I knew that as long as we had faith, we would prevail against the darkness. A few weeks later, Father Augustine and I were called back to the Vatican for a debriefing. We were met by Cardinal Lucius, a stern man with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. He listened intently as Father Augustine recounted the events at Riverton Asylum, occasionally nodding but never interrupting. When Father Augustine finished, Cardinal Lucius turned to me. "And you, Father Daniel, what did you witness?" I took a deep breath, recounting the horrors we had faced, the malevolent force that had possessed Mark, and the unwavering faith of Father Augustine. As I spoke, I could see a flicker of something in the cardinal's eyes. Approval, perhaps, or recognition. "You did well," he said finally. "Both of you. The Church is proud of your efforts." "Thank you, Your Eminence," Father Augustine replied, bowing his head. "But," Cardinal Lucius continued, "we must remain vigilant. There are forces at work in this world that seek to undermine our faith, to corrupt the innocent and the weak. We must be ever watchful, ever ready to confront the darkness." "Yes, Your Eminence," we replied in unison. As we left the Vatican, I felt a sense of renewed purpose. The experience at Riverton Asylum had changed me, deepened my faith, and strengthened my resolve. I knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but I also knew that I was not alone. With the support of the Church and the guidance of mentors like Father Augustine, I was ready to face whatever darkness lay ahead. Months passed, and the memory of Riverton Asylum began to fade, replaced by the routine of daily life and the constant demands of the parish. Yet, in the quiet moments when I knelt in prayer or gazed at the flickering candles in the chapel, the images would return. The blood-stained walls, the bone-chilling growls, the eyes as black as coal. One evening, as I was preparing for bed, the phone rang. It was Dr. Hughes. "Father Daniel," she said, her voice trembling. "Something's happened. You need to come back." "It's Mark." My heart sank. "What's wrong?" He's been having nightmares, terrible nightmares. He says the demon is still inside him." I felt a chill run down my spine. "I'll be there as soon as I can." I called Father Augustine, and together we made the journey back to Riverton Asylum. The building looked even more foreboding in the pale moonlight, its shadows stretching long and dark across the grounds. Dr. Hughes met us at the entrance, her face drawn and pale. "He's in his room," she said. "I've tried everything, but nothing seems to help. He's terrified, and I'm scared too." "We'll handle it," Father Augustine assured her. "Stay with the other staff. Keep everyone away from his room." We made our way to Mark's room, the memories of our previous visit flooding back. As we approached, we could hear his anguished cries. The door to Mark's room was ajar, and a dim, flickering light spilled out into the hallway. Father Augustine and I exchanged a glance before pushing the door open. The scene inside was even more harrowing than our last encounter. Mark was strapped to the bed with heavy leather restraints, his body convulsing violently. His cries were heart-wrenching, a mix of pain and sheer terror. But something felt off. There was a strange, almost clinical detachment to his suffering, as if he were performing rather than experiencing true torment. Father Augustine began the exorcism rites immediately, his voice echoing with the same unwavering authority. "In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, I command you to leave this child of God." Mark's eyes snapped open, wide and wild. He stared directly at me, and in that moment, I saw not the malevolence of a demon, but the raw, desperate plea of a boy in pain. "Help me," he whispered, barely audible over Father Augustine's chants. "Please. They're coming." Confusion twisted my thoughts. "Who's coming, Mark? What are you talking about?" Before he could respond, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening crash. I spun around to see Dr. Hughes and two orderlies standing in the doorway, their expressions eerily calm. "Father Daniel," Dr. Hughes said with a cold smile, "I'm afraid you've misunderstood the situation." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" Father Augustine's prayers faltered as he turned to face the newcomers. "What is the meaning of this?" Dr. Hughes stepped forward, her demeanor transforming from the concerned doctor we had known into something far more sinister. "You see, Mark isn't possessed. He's our lure, our bait. The real demons, well, they're right here." With a wave of her hand, the two orderlies moved toward us, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Father Augustine tried to raise his crucifix, but one of the orderlies swatted it away with inhuman strength. "What have you done to him?" I demanded, backing away toward the bed where Mark lay, still trembling. Dr. Hughes laughed, a sound devoid of any humanity. "Mark has been useful in drawing you here, just as he has drawn others before you. This asylum is a trap, a feeding ground for us, and now you will join our collection." Father Augustine and I were forced to our knees by the overpowering strength of the orderlies. Dr. Hughes began to chant in a language that was neither Latin nor any human tongue I recognized. The air grew thick with a palpable sense of evil, and I realized with dawning horror that we had been ensnared in a web far darker and more complex than any simple possession. "Father Augustine," I called out, my voice shaking, "we have to get out of here." But Father Augustine was focused, his eyes closed in fervent prayer. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, he leadeth me beside the still waters." Dr. Hughes hissed in anger, her chant rising in volume. The room began to shake and the lights flickered wildly. "Silence him," she commanded, and one of the orderlies moved to strike Father Augustine. In that moment, Mark summoned the last of his strength. With a mighty heave, he broke one of the leather restraints and grabbed the orderly by the throat. "Run," he gasped, his eyes locking onto mine. "Get out of here and tell them. Tell everyone." The distraction gave me the moment I needed. I surged to my feet, pulling Father Augustine up with me. "We have to go now." Father Augustine's eyes snapped open, and together we pushed past the orderlies, who were momentarily thrown off balance. Dr. Hughes screamed in rage as we barreled through the door and into the hallway. The asylum was a labyrinth of shadow and echo, the walls seeming to close in around us. The cries of other patients, or perhaps other victims, filled the air, creating a cacophony of despair. We ran, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, every corner feeling like a potential trap. "We need to get to the main entrance," Father Augustine panted. "If we can get outside, we might have a chance." As we rounded a corner, I glanced back and saw the orderlies in pursuit, their eyes blazing with unholy fire. Dr. Hughes was nowhere to be seen, but her presence seemed to permeate the very air, a constant, oppressive force. The main entrance loomed ahead, the heavy double doors our only hope of escape. We reached them and shoved against the wood with all our might. For a heart-stopping moment, they resisted, but then they burst open, spilling us out into the cold night air. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and finally managed to start the engine. We sped away from the asylum, the dark silhouette shrinking in the rearview mirror. "Father Augustine," I said, my voice trembling, "what was that? What are they?" He shook his head, his face pale and drawn. "I don't know, but we need to warn the church. They need to know about this place." As we drove, the reality of our escape settled in. We had barely made it out alive, but the true horror was that the asylum still stood, a bastion of evil hidden in plain sight. Mark's fate was sealed, but his warning would not go unheeded. We reached the nearest town and found a payphone. Father Augustine called the diocese, explaining our situation in urgent, clipped tones. They promised to send help, but there was an undercurrent of disbelief in their voices. After all, how could such a place exist without their knowledge? As we waited for the authorities, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold unseen eyes. Every whisper carried on the wind a sinister intent. The asylum's reach was long, and I knew we were far from safe. Hours later, a team from the diocese arrived, accompanied by local law enforcement. We led them back to Riverton Asylum, but as we approached, the building seemed to have changed. The shadows were deeper, the air colder, and an eerie silence hung over the place. The officers forced the doors open and stormed inside, but what they found was a hollow shell. The rooms were empty, the walls bare, the floors covered in a thick layer of dust. There was no sign of Dr. Hughes, the orderlies, or any of the other staff. Even Mark's room was empty, the restraints hanging limply from the bed. "It's as if they were never here," one of the officers muttered, shaking his head. Father Augustine and I exchanged a glance. We knew the truth, but proving it would be nearly impossible. The asylum had been a front, a facade hiding something far darker. As we left the building, I noticed a faint symbol carved into the doorframe, a mark I recognized from the cryptic symbols in Mark's room. It was a warning, a promise that the evil within Riverton Asylum was not gone, merely hidden. We returned to the parish, our hearts heavy with the knowledge of what we had faced. Father Augustine continued his prayers, seeking guidance and strength, while I delved into ancient texts, searching for any clue that might explain what we had encountered. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. But the memory of Riverton Asylum lingered, a shadow that refused to fade. And then, one night, I heard a voice. "Father Daniel," it whispered, soft and insistent. "Help me." I turned, but there was no one there. The room was empty, the shadows still, yet the voice continued, growing louder, more desperate. "Help me," it cried. "They're coming." I realized with a start that the voice was Father Augustine's. I rushed to his quarters, finding him kneeling in prayer, his face contorted in agony. "Father Augustine, what's wrong?" He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a darkness that chilled me to the bone. "It's too late," he rasped. "They've found me." Before I could react, he collapsed, his body writhing as if in the grip of some unseen force. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and a deep, guttural growl filled the room. "No," I whispered, backing away. "Not again." Father Augustine's body convulsed, and he let out a blood-curdling scream. His eyes rolled back, and his mouth twisted into a terrifying smile. "You cannot escape," he said in a voice that was not his own. "We are his children, and we will find you." I ran from the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The asylum might have been a trap, but its evil had spread far beyond its walls. I had to get out, to warn others, to find a way to fight back. As I fled into the night, I knew that the battle was far from over. Riverton Asylum had been a gateway, a portal to something much darker, and the true horror was that it was still out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting to strike again. The church had no record of Riverton Asylum, no knowledge of the evil that lurked within its walls. But I did.